The story of the infamous 5 Points of Lower Manhattan is one of extreme violence, disease, and poverty. It was also the first place that voluntary desegregation occurred, when the free blacks lived alongside the immigrated white Irish, fleeing from the potato famine before the Civil War began. In fact, the cultural exchange between these two groups would yield an American classic, tap dancing. But how did the area get that way? Collect Pond was a freshwater pond that originally occupied the area that would become Paradise Square, and later in the mid-1800s, the 5 Points. In the early 1800s, New York City had transformed the pond into an open sewer. A project was initiated to fill the sewer with earth from an adjacent hill. In order to drain the polluted waters, designers opened a 40-foot wide canal that is now known as Canal Street. Since the pond was poorly filled, odor started leaking through the area, and the area of Paradise Square started sinking. This caused the wealthier and middle-class residents to leave the area, so the poor and criminal element moved in. The literal 5 Points was the intersection of 5 streets: Mulberry, Anthony, now Worth Street, Cross, now Park, Orange, now Baxter, and Little Water Street, which no longer exists. Since the area was built over this pond and the drainage was inadequate, and the close living quarters of the residents and lack of proper hygiene, diseases like cholera ran rampant. Many people lived in small tenements with much of their family and boarders living in 1 or 2 room apartments. Some of these tenements still stand today. Several gangs were formed, including the Dead Rabbits and the Bowery Boys. These 2 gangs would start a riot in 1857 that would last for several days until the New York State Militia had to step in. In addition to the violence of these early mobsters, there were other types of crimes, from prostitution to muggings and worse. The politics of the area were also corrupt. Elections were often fraudulent, and the police were disorganized and fought amongst themselves. After the publication of How the Other Half Lives, Studies Among the Tenements of New York in 1890 by Jacob Riis, the middle and upper classes were made aware of how bad Lower Manhattan had become. This caused a public outcry, and the area was renovated with proper plumbing and sewers. This book was such a shock that it ended what is commonly thought of as the 5 Points era. The 5 Points, however, remained into the early 20th century and gave rise to more prominent mobsters like Lucky Luciano and Al Capone. During excavations for construction of a courthouse in the 1990s, hundreds of thousands of artifacts were discovered from the 5 Points. They were stored at 6 World Trade Center, awaiting a permanent home when the building was destroyed in the attacks of September 11, 2001. Only 18 of these artifacts remain, as they were out on loan. There is not a lot left of the old 5 Points area. The original intersection no longer exists, and where there were saloons and tenements, now stand courthouses and federal buildings. Nearby, a park was renamed from Civil Court Park to Collect Pond Park to help preserve the past of this area. In Hollywood, interest in this time period is still popular, as seen in the Academy Award-winning Martin Scorsese film, The Gangs of New York, which is based on the nonfiction book, The Gangs of New York, by Herbert Asbury, which was published in 1928. Also, on BBC America, they produce a currently running series called Copper that follows the life of an officer in the 1860s 5 Points district.